Superheroes and comic book adaptations have dominated the film and TV landscape over the last decade, but the landscape of video games hasn't been similarly affected. Sure, comic book video games do exist, and we're finally starting to see more big-budget games adapting the material, but when you look at the biggest video game franchises, superheroes have been largely absent. And that's surprising because superheroes and video games should go hand in hand. So many games are power fantasies, and being a superhero is a pretty big power fantasy, right? Many game protagonists might as well be superheroes in terms of competence, skill, and their ability to cheat death. Making the protagonist an actual superhero is a nice excuse for some of the artifice of game design. Plus, they provide their own pre-existing lore, villains, locations, and storylines. So while Marvel and DC have been making billions at the box office, where have all the superhero games been? Shouldn't there have been just as many high-profile successes? Shouldn't it be easier to sell superheroes to the video game crowd than to the masses? The thing is, they tried before. Superhero games were prevalent in the decades before they took over Hollywood, and while they weren't universally bad, they gained a reputation of mediocrity. These games were created and sold more on brand recognition than quality. In 2009, English developer Rocksteady released a game that bucked that trend. A game that sought to live up to the potential the superhero genre has in the realm of video games. Batman: Arkham Asylum. Rather than adapting a pre-existing story and plastering Batman wallpaper on a generic framework, Rocksteady created their own Batman continuity, and their own gameplay systems to match. Every aspect of the game, its moody visuals, stylish combat, and charismatic villains, was thoroughly Batman. I remember plowing through the game in a couple of days over Thanksgiving break in 2009. I couldn't stop until I had finished it. It wasn't just good for a superhero game, or a licensed game. It was good without qualification. Batman: Arkham Asylum was my introduction to the larger Batman mythos. I didn't grow up with superhero comics, television, or movies. I was brought into the fold by the Dark Knight film trilogy. I really like those movies, but it's a very particular version of Batman, showing just a small handful of characters, concepts, and stories retooled to fit director Christopher Nolan's down-to-earth version of the Batman universe. This isn't a direct critique of any Batman media except for the Arkham games, but it is important to point out that Batman, like many comic book characters, has been continuously reinterpreted across decades and mediums. A lot of fans have strong opinions about who the real Batman is. I reject the idea that there is a definitive Batman. A character who's existed since 1939, rewritten and redefined by a small army of artists and authors, can't really be said to have a definitive version, even if there are common traits and themes at play. The Arkham games take cues broadly from the comic books, and more particularly from Batman the Animated Series. The first two games were written by Paul Dini, who worked extensively on the show, and was one of the co-creators of Joker's girlfriend Harley Quinn, a character who appears in every Arkham title. Several of the voice cast are also the same, notably Kevin Conroy as Batman and Mark Hamill as the Joker. Arkham Asylum stars a Batman who's already an experienced crime fighter. He's got an implied history with his enemies and allies. The Arkhamverse allows for the full spectrum of Batman villains to exist in its world, from A-listers like the Joker to obscure and silly characters like Calendar Man or the Mad Hatter. Although many of the more outlandish villains don't appear directly in the first game, their inclusion via Easter eggs and unlockable bios is suggestive of a larger canon. The Dark Knight was frightening because it imported a psychotic killer clown into a reality recognizable as our own, preying upon our post-9/11 fears about terrorists, and the responses from those who were meant to protect us that were sometimes just as chilling. In contrast, the world of Batman: Arkham Asylum is highly stylized. This is a comic book universe, a dark, surreal, alternate world that works on its own terms. It's a reality removed a couple of steps from ours, and filtered through the lens of gothic and noir fiction. Being deliberately fanciful disarms the player. The darker elements of the story, like the high body count, the insane asylum setting, and the pervasively macabre atmosphere, stand out more because of this. It's a caricature, but caricatures can be frightening and grotesque, as well as humorous. This is the principle by which the Joker himself works. It's a character who's evil, psychotic, murderous, and yet cartoonishly over the top, always cracking wise and laughing, even, sometimes especially, when things aren't going his way. It's unsettling. The whole game is kind of like that. There's a disturbing dissonance between the serious setting and the crazy events and people there. Setting the game in Arkham Asylum was a brilliant idea. It keeps the action confined to a relatively small, self-contained area, but one that's large enough and diverse enough to provide a variety of play spaces. Best of all, the setting is a perfect excuse for Batman to face a parade of goons and supervillains through the course of the game. Arkham Island drips with palpably creepy atmosphere. Even as Batman, you should be a little on edge wandering around in a prison for the criminally insane, and you are. Mental asylums and sanatoriums are largely a relic of the past, but they persist in cultural memory as places where we sent people with problems we didn't understand and couldn't deal with. Often the treatment and the living conditions were horrifying. Rehabilitation turned to incarceration. Care turned to abuse. It's chilling to think about how procedures like lobotomy, the severing of connections in the brain, was once an accepted medical procedure, despite its highly negative effects on the patient. It wasn't even that long ago. The Batman comics themselves would be several decades old before the practice was abandoned worldwide. The procedure is even brought up in the game if you find enough Spirit of Arkham optional collectibles. These stone tablets scattered around the facility tell some of the history of the asylum and its ill-fated founder Amadeus Arkham. Like Batman himself, Arkham Asylum was birthed out of personal tragedy at the hands of Gotham's dark underbelly. What began as a quest to understand and help violent criminals of the city morphed into sadistic revenge under the current warden, Quincy Sharp, who has secretly become a murderous psychopath himself.
I began my day returning home in good spirits, eager to see my wife and family. I ended it kneeling in their blood, broken fragments of my life, pouring through dripping red fingers.
Whether you know this history or not, it still informs Arkham Asylum as a fictional place. The facility is part mental asylum, part hospital, part supermax prison, part mad scientist lab, part haunted house. The asylum's architecture is a mixture of old Gothic structures, complete with gargoyles, and modern industrial technology that's been retrofitted into the facility. The new is built atop or forced in among the old. This blending of styles, the old decaying Gotham alongside the new, persists throughout the series. The old evokes the medical and institutional horrors of our past, but the newer elements remind us that while our understanding and capabilities have increased, the human race is still dangerously prone to abuse and misuse our technology. We've progressed, but human cruelty, apathy, and corruption persist. Arkham Asylum is not a friendly place. Parts of the game are straight-up horror. It doesn't pull any punches with regard to the violence. The villains are unrelentingly cruel and sadistic, grotesque in appearance. Insane, violent people are everywhere. Corpses of dead police, prison guards, staff, and EMTs litter the facility, a place where literal monsters are housed. Even though you're the Batman, an undefeatable symbol of justice and strength, there's a constant tension as you move about the facility, on edge about what awful situation or monstrous villain you'll find next. All of this atmosphere is supported by excellent art direction. Built on the capable Unreal Engine 3, the game looks pretty great for its age, especially if you play it on PC with maximum graphics settings and modern resolutions. Main characters are wonderfully realized with highly detailed models and animations, at least during important story moments. If you scrutinize the details, you'll certainly notice how technically dated the game is, but dark environments obscure a lot of these blemishes, and they're hardly noticeable most of the time. Great art design makes up for a lot. The game has a very simple story. I think that's deliberate. All of the other Arkham games have big ideas. They revolve around significant events in Batman's career. But Arkham Asylum feels episodic, a more generic Batman and Joker story. The Joker escapes, causes mayhem, pretends not to have a plan but totally does, and Batman does his thing and foils it all. It was far more important for Rocksteady to get the gameplay right than to tell a groundbreaking story. That's almost always the right focus for a game. It's not that you can't do both, but in any creative endeavor, there are always compromises, always opportunity costs. That's probably even more true of video games than other art forms. There are a lot of games where you can tell that the needs of the story outweighed thinking about the player experience first and foremost. Arkham Asylum is not one of those games. What the story lacks in substance, it makes up for in the quality of its presentation. The game introduces itself with a lengthy interactive cutscene that does an incredible job of building a tense, foreboding atmosphere. Batman delivers a freshly captured Joker to Arkham. You venture deeper and deeper into the facility, past heavy doors, security checkpoints, and armed guards. You're truly descending into an awful place. Batman suspects something is about to go horribly wrong, and the player knows it must in order for there to be a video game. That puts Batman and the player in a similar mindset right from the start, both suspicious, both genre-savvy. Naturally, the Joker planned to be caught so he could take over the asylum. Ultimately, he plans to create super soldier brutes and unleash them on Arkham and then Gotham proper. He does this using Titan, a derivative of the compound that Bane uses to bulk up. While this is a fine enough plot for purposes of gameplay, I always felt it was wrong for the Joker. He's not a villain who uses pure brawn. His methods are chaotic and sadistic. Nobody really remembers Arkham Asylum for the central plot, though. It's a game of memorable individual moments and scenes, strong voice acting performances, and solid, excellently paced gameplay. If the concepts are a little dull, the execution is almost always excellent. These elements effectively compensate for the perfunctory story, except maybe for the ending of the game, when the story's problems become impossible to overlook. The game gets a lot of mileage out of a great premise and setting. Sometimes those are all you need. It became a cliche in reviews of this game to say that it makes you feel like Batman. What they meant by that is the game takes some of Batman's traits and translates them into game mechanics. Batman is a highly trained fighter, so basic combat in Arkham Asylum is streamlined and simple for the player. Batman hates guns, so guns are one of the few things that can kill you very quickly. Batman is usually one step ahead of his enemies, so there are many encounters where you strike from the shadows, stealthily picking off the bad guys. Batman is rich, so you're outfitted with a plethora of high-tech gadgets. Gameplay in the Arkham series can be broken down into three main pillars: traversal, melee combat, and predator stealth sequences. Detective mode aids all types of gameplay. It's essentially augmented X-ray vision that highlights enemies and important environmental objects. A lot of games have something like this, but fail to give satisfying in-universe explanations for the mechanic. It feels right at home here with the other Wayne Tech gadgets at your disposal. Melee combat uses the free flow system. This system brilliantly represents the kind of stylish hand-to-hand fighting superheroes are known for. Free flow allows you to easily chain attacks together and move from enemy to enemy smoothly with a minimum of effort. Rather than making the combat rely on complicated button combos, it's more about timing, positioning, and crowd control. Batman can strike, counterattack, stun, and dodge enemies. Each move is mapped to its own button. As you land successive attacks, your combo meter builds, along with Batman's speed and attack power. You don't need to be right next to an enemy to attack or counter them. There's some range to these moves, which increases with your combo meter. Batman will close the distance between enemies with flips, kicks, and uppercuts. The way the attack and transition animations flow together really makes these fights something to behold. It does a great job of showing Batman as the ninja he's so often portrayed to be. A brutal yet elegant melee fighter. Moving from enemy to enemy, landing successive punches interspersed with counterattacks and topped off with a special combo move, all with ever-increasing speed, is intoxicating. There's a lovely rhythm to battles, generally only broken by your mistakes. You can queue up a counterattack while in the middle of a strike against another enemy, and Batman will smoothly transition from his current attack to a counter. Thanks to that, you'll almost never be hit by an enemy because you were in the middle of another action, unless you fail to press the counterattack button. That means there's very little waiting around for the right time to attack. You can almost always be actively driving a fight, because you'll be able to counter enemies just about any time. One move you can't cancel is the ground takedown. Enemies will fall down after a few strikes, but won't be out of the fight just yet. You can perform a context-sensitive knockout punch, but it's a very long animation during which Batman is vulnerable. It will finish off the enemy quickly, but it's difficult to pull off in groups, making for a nice speed versus safety risk-reward proposition. Basic combat is expanded over the course of the game with upgrades, including new moves, combos, abilities, and gadgets that can be employed in combat. Batman can quick-fire certain gadgets like his batarangs or the Batclaw to help keep enemies from overwhelming you. If your combo meter is high enough, you can perform instant takedowns. Combat in the early game is largely a matter of rhythm. Strike, 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 counter, maybe dodge here or there if things get too hairy, and that's about it. But Arkham Asylum is nothing if not excellently paced. About the time a new player has basic combat down, new enemy types start getting sprinkled into the fray. Knife-wielding enemies can't be counterattacked, only dodged, and they must be stunned before you can safely attack them. Enemies carrying stun sticks can only be safely attacked from behind. Some later combat arenas have gun caches that enemies will break into once Batman shows up, and guns will drain your health in seconds. These wrinkles give battles a strategic layer. You need to prioritize certain enemies and save others for later. Any of these weapons can be knocked away from an enemy and picked up by others, so you have to stay vigilant once they're in play. Crowd management becomes more complicated than just timing your punches and counters right. I can't emphasize enough how the visual and audio presentation of these fights make the game feel amazing. The animation blending in these combat encounters was immediately impressive in 2009. I had never seen anything like it. A well-executed fight looks choreographed, but the player is making it happen in real time. You're writing the script on the fly, but it has the potential to look as spectacular as something preconceived. I'm still impressed with this system. Each hand-to-hand combat encounter ends with the final blow delivered in glorious slow motion, accompanied by some really crunchy impact sound effects, which really sells the brutality of the fights. It's a great way to cap off each fight and reward the player with some action eye candy, at least when the dynamic camera is working. While Batman can hold his own against melee fighters, taking on a group of armed men directly is suicide. That's when a stealthy approach becomes necessary in the game's Predator encounters. Free-flow fights can take place anywhere, but Predator arenas are designed to give you hiding places from which to survey and strike. You hunt your enemy from the shadows, picking them off one or two at a time, dropping from above, ambushing from below, coming from behind. Batman's grapnel gun lets you quickly move around arenas. In seconds, you can drop from a vantage point near the ceiling and hide beneath the floor inside a grate, waiting for your next opportunity to strike. Just as quickly, you can grapple back up to a high point to survey and plan your next move. You're outmatched in these sections. Once spotted, your health can melt away fast before you have the chance to escape. Even if you do escape, you'll almost certainly take a significant amount of damage before you can slip back into hiding. You can't afford to be seen too much or too long. What evens the odds, really tilts them in your favor, is Detective Mode. Detective Mode isn't terribly useful during free-flow combat, but it's practically essential in stealth. With it, you can easily see the number of enemies and their location. It also highlights vents, grates, destructible walls, and other environmental elements which can be turned to your advantage. Enemy behavior is well balanced between predictable and random. You can manipulate them to some degree, but not so much as to trivialize stealth. When you take down an enemy, others will come to investigate, and then spread out from there to search for Batman, giving you an opportunity to strike. Enemies react to players' actions in deliciously satisfying ways. As you winnow their numbers, threats directed at Batman like, "We're gonna find you, freak!" turn to cries of, "Please don't hurt me!" The Joker adds his own running commentary. Like his henchmen, he taunts Batman at first, but as you succeed, he eventually turns on his own people for their failures, taking a perverse joy in their fear and pain as Batman finishes them off.
Hey, Bats, I know you can hear me. I want you to hurt these guys. They're nothing to me.
It's a fun dynamic that helps add some extra characterization and life to stealth sections. You are the hunter and they are the prey. And it wouldn't feel fair or heroic, except that if you stepped out of the shadows to fight them head on, you'd be dead before the Joker could finish one of his taunts. Later Predator encounters add more enemies to the mix, and a couple of new behaviors. but it's not as much of a mix-up as the melee combat receives throughout the game. Predator sequences actually get more interesting when you take some options away from the player. The game's best Predator sequence comes about 3/4 of the way through the game in the intensive treatment lobby. It's a room you've visited previously. One of the earliest stealth sequences took place there, so you should be familiar with the general layout. That knowledge proves very valuable because this time use of vantage points is restricted. Now the gargoyles are rigged to explode a few seconds after you land on one. Complicating things further, some of the henchmen wear heart rate collars, so when they're taken out, the other enemies instantly know, and now you can't just grapple up to the ceiling for an easy getaway. You have to think ahead a little more than usual and explore other tactics. These elements in tandem make it a tricky encounter, but it's very satisfying, proving that you don't need vantage points to take out a room full of armed guards. Combat and stealth are broken up with some traversal and light puzzle solving using Batman's gadgets. This aspect of the game, while less distinct than the combat, is still exceptionally well designed. It may be downtime, but it's not boring. These in-between moments are crucial to the pacing. They give the more intense moments room to breathe and allow the player to soak in the foreboding atmosphere. Your arsenal of gadgets grows, allowing you to reach entirely new areas and secrets that you couldn't before. The gadgets are universally good additions to the game. They feel satisfyingly tactile thanks to the accompanying animations and sound effects. Most of them can be used in and out of combat. Thanks to Detective Mode, getting stuck for too long is relatively rare. It helpfully parses the detailed 3D environments, clearly showing what's interactive and what's merely cosmetic. That lets the artists pack these environments with details that further the world building and environmental storytelling, without getting in the way of the player navigating the space or solving puzzles. Combat and puzzle solving award the player with experience points. Each level up grants you 1 upgrade point to enhance Batman's abilities. It's a very nascent upgrade tree compared to the sequels, but these additional moves and abilities do change the way you play. Some moves, like the inverted takedown, are granted from the start in the sequels, and that makes going back to Arkham Asylum feel particularly restrictive to a veteran of the series. Of all Batman's attributes, his skill as a detective is the most poorly represented, not just in this game, but in broader media portrayals of the character generally. To be fair, crime solving and detective work is harder to represent in a mechanically satisfying and repeatable way than combat, and there are far fewer games in that genre to pull inspiration from. In Arkham Asylum, Batman uses a modified version of detective mode called the Evidence Scanner. During several points in the game, you'll use it to look for forensics. In practical terms, this means you'll go into first person, look around a small scene until your reticle locks onto the evidence, and then follow a trail to your next objective. The first time it happens, it's a neat inclusion that helps further characterize Batman. Each subsequent time, it's increasingly tedious. The mechanic just isn't that interesting. Following a dotted line does not make the player feel like the world's greatest detective. There's no deduction, no test of the player's knowledge, no assembling of clues, just a breadcrumb trail. Batman will make smart, detective-like observations from time to time, but the player isn't participating in any meaningful way in the detective aspect of the character. Although Arkham Asylum is basically linear, you have ample opportunity to explore at your leisure. It's not an open world, but it is an interconnected one. You'll see surprisingly few loading screens for a game of this age. Arkham Island feels like a cohesive whole. The meat of the game takes place inside the various buildings on the island, with some detours underground. Later on, you'll return to some previously visited areas, but it's the good kind of backtracking. Rooms change, your toolset changes, the enemies you encounter change. The asylum is recontextualized mechanically and narratively, so backtracking never feels like recycled content or padding. As you make your way through the story, Batman's suit and cape gets more and more worn down with cuts and tears. It's a neat detail that shows your progress and reinforces the physicality of the combat. Batman is highly trained, but he's still just a man. He's not unscathed by the game's events. Later games in the series, of course, added to and refined the gameplay, but for the most part, the staples are all right here in the first game, just with a few sharp edges. For example, in later games, Batman can climb and perch on objects like railings. You can't do this in Asylum, and it makes dropping down on enemies or even just dropping behind them more of a chore than it needs to be. I definitely died a few times because of clumsy control issues that aren't present in later games. Every gameplay system is improved in the sequels in such a way that revisiting Arkham Asylum feels a little basic and a tiny bit bland at times, particularly the Predator sequences. But the core gameplay is solid and satisfying, and combined with excellent pacing, it's still a very compelling game to play. Boss fights are a video game convention that fits right in with the superhero genre. The Batman canon has a wide variety of memorable villains to choose from, and Arkham Asylum includes run-ins with a bunch of them. The Joker, Harley Quinn, Bane, Scarecrow, Poison Ivy, Victor Zsasz, and Killer Croc are all confronted directly, and many others are hinted at. While villain encounters represent some of the most memorable parts of the game, both for their presentation and game design, the more traditional boss fights are less successful. Rocksteady nailed free-flow combat, but finding ways to create great boss fights within that framework was a more elusive goal. With such an iconic and varied cast of villains to choose from, there's a lot of potential for fantastic showdowns. Unfortunately, many come up short, at least in a strictly mechanical sense. In Arkham Asylum, too many boss fights are functionally the same. Out of the 11 encounters that can be considered boss fights or sequences, 5 of them are against Titan-enhanced brutes. That's half of them. These enemies are fought and defeated in basically the same way. They're common enough that I'd consider them mini-bosses, or a heavy class of enemy, except one of them is Bane, a named, known supervillain. Oddly, Bane is the second of the Titan-enhanced that you'll fight, instead of the final, most difficult test for this type of combat. Bane is the worst of these encounters because it's such a wasted opportunity. Even though Bane has an obvious weakness that the other brutes don't, you still use the same tactics. It looks like you need to cut the hoses on his back, and that is indeed the solution, but the way you go about it isn't intuitive at all. If you can't figure it out, eventually the game just tells you what to do. In my book, that's a failure of game design. Titan brutes aren't particularly fun to fight. You have to wait for them to charge you, throw a batarang during their run, and once they've stunned themselves by crashing into a wall, go punch them for a bit. You can climb on their back to control them, which is fun in theory, but in practice it feels so sluggish and unresponsive that I rarely come away feeling like I capitalized on the opportunity. These fights are at odds with what makes the normal combat encounters engaging. If you're fighting as usual, moving from enemy to enemy while waiting for an opening on the big guys, you might find yourself in a pretty poor position when they decide to charge. Attacking the big guys at will is very risky since you can't counter their strikes. It's almost guaranteed that you'll take some punishment trying either of these things. The safest strategy is to keep your distance while waiting for openings so you can take out the brutes first. But that's boring, and it runs counter to the strengths of free-flow combat. The best traditional boss fight is against Poison Ivy. It starts off tame enough while you learn what makes this fight unique. It forces you to stay nimble, quick-firing batarangs between dodge rolls. In a second phase, standard enemies are added to the mix, and attacks from Ivy's plants grow more intense. It's the most challenging fight in the game, but it's also intuitive and fair. It works within the free-flow system rather than against it. Outside traditional boss fights, the villain encounters are substantially more interesting. The most memorable parts of the entire game are Batman's encounters with Scarecrow and his hallucinogenic fear toxin. I've seen many trippy sequences in games since, but Arkham Asylum's may be the best of the bunch. They come without much warning. You'll be going about your business, and before long, you're descending into madness. It's especially effective the first time. When you descend into the already creepy basement of the medical facility, a cutscene introduces Scarecrow without fully revealing him. What you do see is his effect on other inmates. As you continue on, reality starts to unravel. Eerie music plays, Batman's eyes glow red, the camera tilts. You chase after Commissioner Gordon in imminent danger. Things get truly surreal in the morgue. The room appears empty, but ghostly voices emanating from the locker doors tell you to leave. But going out the door just leads you back into the morgue again. This time, there are 3 body bags in the center of the room. Naturally, the bags contain Thomas and Martha Wayne, Bruce's murdered parents. Out of their zombified mouths come Bruce's own guilt and shame about having been helpless to do anything about their deaths. Scarecrow preys upon his victims' deepest fears. His toxin doesn't just produce weird visions for their own sake, they come from deep-seated places in the victim's mind. So as the toxin takes further hold, we go from Batman's present fear about failing Commissioner Gordon to his much deeper, older fear about his parents. Batman's greatest fear, of course, is reliving the night of his parents' murder. It is his entire reason for becoming Batman, not so he can take revenge on criminals exactly, but so that he never has to feel the same sense of powerlessness he did in that moment when he was a little boy watching his parents bleed out in a dirty alleyway. Batman is his way of mastering the thing that once mastered him, and in doing so, helping to ensure that others don't have to go through what he did. It's an origin story that we've been reminded of in pop culture over and over again, such that it loses its power to inform us about the psychology of the character. Some origin stories are less formative. Bruce Banner's brush with gamma radiation doesn't have the pathos of Peter Parker losing his Uncle Ben. Like Batman, Spider-Man's origin is one we've heard many times because it's so foundational to the character, and it's grounded and relatable human emotion. Peter may have gotten his superpowers from a radioactive spider bite, but he only becomes Spider-Man after Ben Parker's death. So we may roll our eyes at being reminded of Batman's parents for the umpteenth time, but if you're probing the character's deepest fears, then this is absolutely the right answer. Inside the third and final body bag is Scarecrow himself. After that, reality totally breaks down. The world is literally torn apart, and suddenly Scarecrow is there, giant, imposing, and all-powerful. You're just an ant in his world. Games are uniquely equipped to do these kind of reality-bending sequences. They necessarily require audience participation. The player enters a game world as they participate, learning and obeying its rules. But the game maker can change those rules at any time. With a movie or comic book, you're a passive observer. You can just sit there and watch things play out. You can cover your eyes, you can skip forward. In a game, you're trapped at the mercy of whatever the game is doing. It can pull the rug out from under you, and you just have to deal with it. It's surprising and a little unnerving. It's certainly a very effective way to portray a mind-manipulating villain like Scarecrow. Scarecrow levels are a game of hide and seek. If you're caught in his gaze, it's an instant game over. Instant kill stealth can be frustrating, but the lighting effects make it extremely clear where you can and can't go, and your window for moving from one bit of cover to the next isn't as tight as it seems. You win these Scarecrow levels by climbing to the top and vanquishing the nightmare with the bat signal. It's incredibly fitting. As a symbol of Batman to the city of Gotham, it provokes fear in criminals and relief in everyone else. You're breaking out of Scarecrow's hold by overcoming the fear of failure and helplessness, which is what the persona of Batman has helped Bruce Wayne to do. It's a perfect object to serve as the finish line for these levels. There are 3 encounters with Scarecrow. Repeating the trick risks diluting its effect, but each instance is unique enough to justify its inclusion. It's always a treat when you realize that Scarecrow is intruding upon reality again. The second encounter happens even more unceremoniously. This is a more visually dramatic scene than the first. Once again, it delves into Batman's primary fear. As you walk down a long, seemingly endless corridor in the Arkham mansion, lightning flashes transform it into Crime Alley, the scene of his parents' murder. After reliving that fateful moment, you play as 8-year-old Bruce Wayne, briefly recalling the lowest point in his life. The first 2 hallucinations focus on Batman's fears. The third and final Scarecrow encounter breaks the fourth wall to engage the players. What would scare a player who's already seen 2 of these Scarecrow scenes before? How about a simulated game crash? This really got my heart racing the first time it happened. It's very convincing, at least for the PC platform. I've had actual crashes that looked and sounded almost exactly like this, except for the Joker laugh, of course. When the game reboots, the opening scenes of Arkham Asylum play again. This time Batman and Joker's roles are reversed. Batman is the escaped inmate, Joker is the player character bringing him in. Harley Quinn is the warden, and the inmates are the staff of the asylum. It's a common assertion, inside and outside the fiction, that Batman is just as crazy as the criminals he fights. He's a billionaire who spends his time dressed as a bat doing illegal vigilante work. Doesn't he belong in the asylum too? The Joker is particularly fond of this kind of thinking, and he tries all throughout the Arkham series to draw moral and psychological equivalencies between them. At the end of this scene, you go back to Batman's perspective. You're helpless to do anything but look around. Then the Joker pulls out a gun and shoots you point blank. You die. There's an actual game over screen. I was really mad when this happened. There are plenty of games with unfair QuickTime events, and this seemed like one of those. What was I supposed to do to prevent that? Use the middle stick to dodge? This isn't a real death, of course. It's the game messing with the player again. The final Scarecrow level is longer and more elaborate, interspersed with fight sequences. After breaking the toxin's hold on Batman, you pursue Scarecrow into the sewers, where he's taken out of the picture by the next villain you have to face. While Scarecrow's appearances are unpredictable, Killer Croc is built up through the whole game, beginning with the opening scene. He's the first massive bad guy you see, and despite being restrained, in fact because of it, is extremely intimidating. Later on, you can encounter Croc in the sewers. Although he's behind an impassable door, it's still a chilling reminder that this thing is out there, and you're probably going to have to deal with that at some point. Of course, the plot eventually dictates that Batman enter Croc's lair. Is all that build-up worth it? Does Killer Croc live up to the hype? Well, yes and no. You don't actually fight Croc. In fact, Batman wants to avoid a direct confrontation, so you sneak through his lair. In essence, it's a stealth encounter, but one that's mechanically distinct from the game's Predator sequences. You're in Croc's territory. There are no convenient gargoyles to grapple to or grates to hide in. I love the idea of an enemy that Batman can't just beat in a straight fight. He's got to use his wits, his training, and his gadgets to get by. And this approach would later be used to great effect in the sequels. There are whole games based on cat and mouse stealth scenarios where the enemy can't be defeated, but merely evaded while you accomplish your objectives. I like bringing a little of that dread, a little splash of survival horror to Batman. Waiting for Croc to appear for the first time is genuinely tense. Sewer levels are a cliché in video games, but Croc's lair rises above the generic quality of the setting. These sewers feel alienating. The sound design does a lot of heavy lifting to create the impression of a labyrinthine sewer system, the map of which has been lost to time. You're forced to slowly move around the area on floating platforms, making as little noise as possible. Move too fast, too suddenly, and Croc will spring from the water to attack. Unfortunately, the tension isn't maintained because this sequence ultimately asks so little from the player. When Croc appears, all you have to do is throw a batarang. One single batarang, which will activate his shock collar and send him back into the water. This is trivially easy to pull off. Batarangs are unlimited lock-on projectiles. This tactic requires no strategy, planning, or resource management, and almost no skill or reflexes at all. So while the first few encounters with Croc are scary, the tension quickly dissipates. Even if you're walking slowly and silently, Croc will still appear. It's actually necessary because he breaks through walls, opening paths you have to take. This happens on a pretty regular basis once you get going. In my playthrough, he showed up at about 10 to 30 second intervals, minus any time it took to collect spore samples or shock him. The only real unknown is where he'll pop up next. That's unpredictable and a little unnerving because of the thought that he might appear behind you, but there's always ample time to turn and throw your batarang. Despite all that, I'm still glad Rocksteady tried something different. Killer Croc could have been just another big brute fight. Instead, it's a unique slice of the game, and while it's unchallenging and eventually loses all tension, it's still one of Arkham Asylum's most memorable sequences. Although he doesn't appear in person, the Riddler also has a memorable presence. Rocksteady made the astute decision to include him as a conduit for collectibles and challenges scattered throughout the game world. Arkham Asylum is a richly detailed place, and Riddler's collectibles and riddles encourage you to slow down and appreciate things you might have otherwise missed. The riddles are particularly good as they tie directly into the Riddler's character and reward observant players, and players familiar with Batman lore. Secret Collection rewards the player with some XP and unlockables, like concept art, character models, and challenge maps, but I found myself engaging in Riddler's activities more for the intrinsic fun of the hunt. My favorite unlockables are the character profiles. Some of these are obtained as you meet new characters in the story, but others are off the beaten path. There are also collectible audio recordings of patient interviews, which further flesh out Arkham's inhabitants. They're pretty chilling on average, whether it's Killer Croc alluding to eating his victims, or Victor Zsasz espousing his completely psychopathic view of the world. Arkham Asylum is a strong game throughout. It never becomes bad, but the vast majority of missteps, both story and gameplay related, are in the final third. Some really irritating enemy types start popping up. Poison Ivy's plants and enemies known as lunatics appear all over the asylum. Neither are huge threats, they're encountered one or two at a time. It's unlikely they'll manage to kill you, but you still have to deal with them. It's not fun, it's not strategic, it's not even cathartic. They're just speed bumps in your path that make moving around the asylum more of a chore than it needs to be. Compare these to the snipers, who also appear later in the game and prevent you from moving around freely. They're highly lethal, can spot you from long distances, and are difficult to evade once you're spotted. They're also annoying, but facing them feels like an actual challenge. You really have to think about your approach to the situation. But with plants and lunatics, it's just the same actions over and over with little consequence for failure. After the Poison Ivy fight, you move into the final stretch. The Joker invites Batman to a party, a final showdown which leads to some great moments, and some of the worst. In a surreal and hilarious scene, you're welcomed to the party by a group of non-hostile enemies wearing party hats and cheering.
Let's see, A, no, that's not right. So B, Bane. Ah, here it is, Batman.
You absolutely do not have to fight these guys, but I couldn't resist. They killed an awful lot of people, and I think they lost their right to party. Throughout the game, you can enter the Visitors Center, a building that seems to serve no gameplay purpose. It's just been for flavor until now. This area is unique among the buildings of Arkham Island. It forces you into a first-person perspective. There's a distinct feeling that something's just not right in this room. At the end of the hall, Joker will speak to you via a mannequin with a TV for a head. In the end, the truth is revealed. It wasn't a mannequin. It was Joker hiding in plain sight the whole time, easily accessible. There are subtle hints about this beforehand. If you look away and back again, he'll have changed positions slightly. You aren't allowed to use detective mode in the room, and there's no in-game reason for that. That would instantly give away the secret, of course. The game sort of cheats here, but it's a fun, memorable reveal, so I can understand why. Rocksteady does a great job of handling the Joker throughout the game. The writing is great, Mark Hamill's performance is terrific, the animation is lively and expressive. Best of all, they never let you forget that the Joker's out there. All over the asylum are the signs of what he's done. Graffiti, dead guards, inmates running loose. His constant radio chatter taunts Batman and his own henchmen in equal measure. The final showdown doesn't live up to what's come before. The Titan plot is my least favorite element of the game, and the ending is why. It makes sense for gameplay, but it just doesn't seem right for the Joker. His strength isn't brawn, it's his cunning, his deviousness. The Joker has the ability to plot evil with the same level of detail and dedication that Batman has to fighting crime. The Joker can't take Batman in a fight, especially not when it's been established that a whole room full of enemies is no match for this version of the Dark Knight. And that's a problem when it comes to making a video game where the Joker is the primary adversary. Perhaps it was inevitable, perhaps Rocksteady thought it would be anticlimactic if you didn't fight the Joker directly at the end. So you do. You fight a giant, ridiculous-looking, Titan-enhanced Joker on top of the asylum because video game convention demands it. This isn't a very good boss fight no matter how you slice it. Thematically, it doesn't work. Mechanically, it's too contrived and easy. You don't even engage the Joker directly for most of the fight. He spends the bulk of his time mugging for TV cameras while you fight regular goons. What was even the point of him bulking up? This final boss fight ends the game on a decidedly lackluster note. Once the Joker's defeated, GCPD takes control of the asylum, the criminals are rounded up, the Titan-enhanced revert to normal. It's all back to the status quo. After a quick chat with Gordon, Batman rushes off to Gotham to fight another crime. A Batman's work is never done. Although Batman and the player went through a lot of struggle to put things right, nothing seems to have changed in the grand scheme of things. Did anyone learn something or grow as a character? Not really. Was the world changed by what happened? Not that we can tell. Did anyone of consequence die? No. Arkham Asylum's ending didn't need earth-shattering significance to be good, but the game is too dark for such an inconsequential one. The sequels would ultimately give more weight to the events of Arkham Asylum, but on its own, there is none, and that always felt deeply unsatisfying to me. It's a tremendously enjoyable game, with a tremendously flaccid ending. The weak ending left a bad taste in my mouth for a long time, but coming back to the game a decade after its release, I'm surprised how well it holds up. Arkham Asylum gets so many things right, it excels where it counts the most. The two things that stand out most particularly among the series as a whole are the atmosphere and the pacing, both impressive feats, especially given the age of the game. And while there are some rough edges with the presentation and boss fights, most of the game is executed really well. It accomplishes almost everything it sets out to do with style and grace. I think flawed masterpiece is an appropriate descriptor. I've seen it argued that Arkham Asylum is the best game in the series because of its purity and focus. I can understand that argument. There is a simple elegance to this game. A narrower scope helped Arkham Asylum to focus on getting the basics right, which is the most important thing when proving a new concept. Batman Arkham Asylum was an amazing game in 2009, and all these years later, it still is. It showed that superhero games didn't have to be cheap cash-ins or movie tie-ins. A superhero game could be great in its own right. But Rocksteady was just getting started.